Good afternoon. My name is Steve Edwards. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics here at the University of Chicago, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you here with us for today's conversation featuring IOP founder and director David Axelrod in conversation with United States Senator Tom Cotton. We are thrilled to have all of you with us, students, faculty, staff, friends, and especially University of Chicago alumni who are returning for Alumni Weekend. Please join me in giving them a warm round of applause. Welcome back to campus. For those of you who are new to IOP events, the Institute of Politics is now finishing its fourth full academic year on campus. It was founded in 2012 with a full launch in 2013 by David Axelrod with a mission and a nonpartisan extracurricular context of cultivating and inspiring and igniting a passion for politics and next-generation public service leadership. One of the principal ways in which we execute that mission is through events like these. Over the course of the academic year, we hold nearly 100 such events in all manner of formats and sizes across an entire range of topics and speeches and featured guests. This event is the final speaker series event of the academic year that's just now ending, and I want to take a brief moment to personally thank two members of our team who have been responsible throughout the year to make this possible. They include Christine Hurley and Mallory McClare, the director of our speaker series and the senior associate director of special events in our speaker series. Please join me in thanking them for their great work. We also have a group of students who work every single one of these events throughout the year, our event ambassadors who contribute tireless time and energy. A round of applause for them as well. Thank you, event ambassadors. We are student-focused here, so at the moment in time when we open up the floor to questions from the audience, we will ask that the first three questions come from students, as is customary, and then we open up the floor to all of you for your questions. We ask that everybody keep their comment short and to the point. Make it a question. A question ends, of course, with a question mark so that we can get to as many people as possible. This is also a great time to make sure your phones are on silent. Also a good time to point out for those of you who are unfamiliar with this building that restrooms are in the basement. You go out of the lobby into the basement of Ida Noyes. I also want to mention that David will be signing copies of his memoir, Believer. They'll be for sale in the lobby, and he'll be out there in the main lobby of Ida Noyes immediately following our event this afternoon at 1:15. There's also another event at 1:15 or soon after we depart, so we'll ask that everybody exit this room as quickly as possible. In addition to the book signing, there will be refreshments in the library lounge just over to your right, which we invite you to partake in as well. This event is part of Alumni Weekend, of course, and we want to thank our partners in the Alumni Relations and Development Office for making this possible too. And with all of those housekeeping bits now finally done, I yield the floor to Conor McDonough. Conor is a fourth year in the college. He's been with us since the beginning. He is the senior chair of our Student Advisory Board, the main leadership body for students at the Institute of Politics. An extraordinary young man, somebody who has been an extraordinary leader for us. And it's been a pleasure to work with you, and I'm pleased to welcome him to close out our final event this year. Conor?
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all for joining us for what we expect will be an enriching and timely conversation. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Senator Tom Cotton. Senator Cotton is the junior senator from Arkansas with an extensive resume in public service. After graduating from Harvard and Harvard Law School, Senator Cotton served in Iraq with the 101st Airborne and in Afghanistan with a provincial reconstruction team. He then returned to the private sector for several years, until his election to Congress in 2012. Just 2 years later, he was elected to the Senate and currently serves on the United States Senate Committee on Armed Services, the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, the Senate Joint Economic Committee, and the Select Committee on Intelligence, which will hear former FBI Director James Comey's testimony next week. Today's conversation is particularly timely on the subject of America's leadership in the world. Senator Cotton was a fierce critic of President Obama's deal-making authority, and with the ongoing Russian probe and Trump's newly announced withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, we are excited to have Senator Cotton in conversation with IOP Director David Axelrod on the most pressing issues facing America and its allies. So, for the last IOP event this year, and my last IOP event as a college student. Please join me in welcoming Senator Tom Cotton and David Axelrod.
Thank you. Senator, welcome to the Institute of Politics of the University of Chicago. Welcome to our students and alumni. I speak as a graduate of the class of '76, so I am one of you.
I went to Harvard, so I didn't have to work so hard.
I know, a lesser institution.
No, honestly, I went to Harvard Law School because I didn't want to work so hard at Chicago Law School.
Now you're pandering.
Me? Never.
So my first question is, you had a beard for a while.
You had a mustache for a while.
We did, a long while. I'll tell my story, and then you tell yours, and I'll tell mine. But we in Illinois, we're partial to tall, lanky, bearded Republicans. So what happened to the beard?
Yeah. Abraham Lincoln, I think it was at one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, was criticized by someone in the audience. In the records of the debates there had these interjections, and somebody in the audience said he was two-faced. And he turned and addressed the member of the audience and said, I'll leave it for the audience to decide. If I had another face at home, do you think I'd be wearing this one right now?
Yes, I know. It's one of the great lines, yes.
Abraham Lincoln would be great in an age of Twitter as a politician. So
presumably he'd know when to do it and when not to.
Abraham Lincoln had a practice when he was angry of writing letters that would vent his anger, and then he would put them in his desk and come back to them at a later time and rarely send them.
No, I think that's honestly, a really great practice.
So my wife gave birth to our second son in December 7th. So when he's a misbehaving teenager, I'll tell him it's a day that lives in infamy. But he was a few weeks early, and he was in the NICU for about 2 weeks. So I was there most all day long, so I wasn't on a regular schedule where I was shaving and putting on a suit and tie and going to work every day. That's why I missed the last week of votes last year. So I started growing a beard while he was in the NICU, and then it was Christmas time. I didn't have public appearances, so I kept it, and my wife liked it, so I figured, why get rid of it? But it gets hot in Arkansas this time of year, so it's too hot to have a beard.
The reason I raise it also is, I think of Lincoln, and we all think of him as the president who led us through the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation. I think of him as the president who paved the way for the Transcontinental Railroad and land-grant colleges and National Science Foundation. And I found myself thinking Democrats should have Lincoln days and Republicans should have Jackson days these days. And it leads to the question of tell me what the Republican Party, as you see it, is today in the age of Donald Trump.
Well, was it Seward when Lincoln passed away that said now he belongs to the ages? So he's a Republican. I'm proud that he was the first Republican president, but I think Abraham Lincoln belongs to all Americans.
Agreed.
And I can tell you what I think the Republican Party stands for. Others might have a different take, but what I think it stands for, I think it stands for the same principles that it was founded on in Abraham Lincoln's day. He had a common slogan back then was free soil, free labor, free men, which stood at root for freedom. It stood for the genius of individual freedom that has been the spark of everything that's great about America going back to our founding. That's why we had our revolution. That's why our country was founded. That's why 600,000 Americans perished in the Civil War so they could have a new birth of freedom, and we still stand for that freedom today. Ultimately, most importantly, that means our natural rights as human beings, that are articulated in the Declaration and the Constitution, but also means that you try to give everybody the greatest freedom of action they can, so they can make a decent living and then pay their bills. They can have a better future for themselves and especially for their kids. That means providing them basic security in their communities and around the world. The exact kind of things that Abraham Lincoln perceived that the American people needed in the 1860s. 1850s when they founded the party, but also that all the great Republican presidents have defended, whether it's TR, Calvin Coolidge, or Dwight Eisenhower, or Ronald Reagan.
But he certainly stood, I mean, I guess the great debate is what should the role of government be in this? He certainly stood for a strong federal government. I mean, we fought war over that partly. And I raised those three issues that he was so active on. I'm so impressed that he was in the midst of the war, but which was essentially the railroad infrastructure, because he knew we had to connect the continent. The land-grant colleges, because he felt like education was the key to the future success, and it shouldn't be the province of just the wealthy. The National Science Foundation, because he knew that scientific innovation was going to be central to progress and to opportunity, and that in all those things, the government needed to play a role in making that happen, and thus broadening the circles of opportunity. Don't we have that same obligation today?
And those are all fair points. And there's more fundamental things that the government has to do than even those. Keeping us safe on our streets, whether it's your local police or keeping us safe from foreign threats. Only the government can do that. But that's not the end of government. The end of government is justice and peace and prosperity. There's a baseline foundation that government has to do those things. But then some of the things that
how can we argue about that? That's no fun.
But you argue about how that's delivered, whether it's about how what we sentence people for certain crimes or when it's right to commit forces abroad. But at a philosophical level, those are the most fundamental reasons we have a government. But those aren't the ultimate reasons that we have a government. Those aren't the reasons that people aspire to when they establish government. They aspire to justice, peace, prosperity, and some of the things that you identified, internal improvements, as they would have said back in Lincoln's day, or education, or the advance of science and the arts. Those are important, and the government does have an important role to play all those. The government can play a counterproductive role in them. It can crowd out private activity or private investment. It can waste taxpayer dollars, and I would say it does that a lot. It's the government after all. But I don't dispute that the government has an important role to play in those areas.
Well, it comes into play because we've seen a budget proposed that cuts all those things, sometimes eliminates them, cuts back on scientific research, cuts back on education. There's infrastructure sort of, are we going to get an infrastructure bill, by the way?
Well, I think the president certainly said that he wants one, and I would say that we haven't seen the details of one yet. I could see that being a 2018 proposition, though. I mean, the Congress has got its hands pretty full right now with health care and taxes and our annual spending process, which is badly broken. Infrastructure is the kind of thing that you'd hope could get bipartisan support. It has in the past, which means it can be done in an election year. As for the president's budget, I'll confess I haven't gone through it line by line, in part because it's very rare to vanishingly happen that the president's budget gets enacted into law. You saw that in 8 years in President Obama's tenure as well. There's some good things in it. The defense spending increase is good. It's probably not enough, nor does it address the fundamental problem of the Budget Control Act and the arbitrary caps that are in place right now. I think trying to impose more work requirement and giving more job training opportunities to people who are on social welfare programs like food stamps or disability are good as well. There's some things I don't support, like the cuts to basic scientific and medical research. I mean, you just had a very big vote at the end of the last Congress on something called the Cures Act, which helped modernize and provide more resources to the National Institutes of Health. So Congress, is responsible for passing our budget and appropriating taxpayer dollars. That's where our power is at its apex, and the president's power is at its zenith. So I think you'll see Congress move forward this year, passing the priorities that we think reflect the people that we serve, whether it's in Arkansas or Illinois or what have you. That's no slight on President Trump or his budget. That's just the way our constitutional system works.
So let me just ask you about the news of the day, and that was the president's decision to withdraw from the climate agreement, the Paris Accord. You say you support that decision. Do you accept that climate change is a man-made phenomenon and that it's a problem?
Sure. So I would say the climate is changing today as it always has been. If you look at the best evidence, it suggests that over the last 200 years or so, the Earth's surface has warmed somewhat. I think it's a very reasonable inference from that evidence that it's warmed in part because of human activity, because of industrialization. Where I think, and that's all backward looking, where I think some climate activists go askew is when they project into the future, much harder to do that, or some of the recommendations that they undertake to try to address a warming surface. In the United States, for instance, we've seen 3 straight years of declining carbon emissions. That's not in large part because of government programs or international agreements. It's because of the revolution we've seen in the production of oil and gas, especially gas. As coal-fired power plants have declined in this country, it's primarily because natural gas has fallen, and that's because we can now unlock a lot of the gas that's caught up in shale formations all around this country that we've been blessed to have. It's that kind of market innovation that in the long run is going to lead to higher standards of environmental protection. That's one reason why the United States, which is the most advanced economy and the richest economy in the world, is also the leader in environmental protection, and a country like China is not so much.
The implication of your answer is that you think that it is a positive thing that natural gas has supplanted coal. Obviously, wind and solar have increased exponentially.
So I would favor an all of the above strategy. Coal is still an important part of our electricity mix. In Arkansas, we get over half of our electricity from coal. I'm a little more worried about what people pay for electricity in Paris, Arkansas, than I am about what was in the Paris Accord. We have one of the most advanced...
That would have been better alliteration for the president than Pittsburgh and Paris, because Pittsburgh wasn't very happy about being included in his speech.
We have one, in Fulton, Arkansas, we have one of the most advanced new generation coal-fired plants in the country. And that's the kind of innovation that we should encourage here. We should encourage it abroad. Frankly, it doesn't really take a government mandate to do those things, though. If you look in China, they're building coal-fired power plants every week. But they have to take into account the environmental impact there, because in some cities in China, they are literally killing their own citizens. And although it's not a democratic country, it's still run by the Communist Party, they can't accept that level of civic unrest that it's going to cause. So countries have their own reasons to address these things. So
they're apparently outstripping their own goals under the Paris Agreement.
That's in part because we set our goals very high, even though they're voluntary. China and India and other countries set their goals very low. People can say that the Paris Accord was not binding, but I would say that it was designed to make it effectually binding, because every year the United States would face political and public pressure because they're not meeting their goals, or potentially binding for real in the sense of law. Democratic attorney generals have already said that they were going to sue under the Clean Air Act to make those goals mandatory. But back to your original point, coal is still an important source of base power here. Even in countries that have tried to move away from it, like Germany, they're finding they've had to move back to it, which is putting incredible strain on their electrical grid and utilities, and also on neighboring countries. Wind and solar, important part of our future. Until we find ways to store electricity on a large scale, and I support basic scientific research funded by the government for that, we have to recognize that those can't provide baseload power, especially the baseload power that industrial sites need, because sometimes the sun doesn't shine and sometimes the wind doesn't blow. We'd be much better investing money from the government, not in subsidies for technologies that are not yet mature, but in the basic scientific research that'll make those technologies mature in the future.
Although the people who got the tax credits, wind and solar producers, would tell you that those tax credits were essential in getting them started and in spurring what has been an exponential growth in those sectors. On this point of climate change, you're obviously an expert, not just as a veteran, but a member of the Armed Services Committee and a member of the Intelligence Committee. That must be a fun committee these days.
It's an oxymoron.
So in written...
It's like military intelligence.
Yeah. In his testimony, written testimony to your committee, Secretary Mattis said climate change is impacting stability in areas of the world where troops are operating today. It is appropriate for the combatant commands to incorporate the drivers of instability that impact the security environment in their areas into their planning. And he went on, it was a fairly lengthy answer on climate change. This is consonant with what the military has been saying for decades now, that climate change is a major source of instability.
Yeah.
Do you accept that?
I accept that it's a challenge that our military has to address.
What about the world?
Well, Secretary Mattis, well, we're talking about the military now,
Yeah.
but Secretary Mattis' statement there is consistent with what many generals before he have said, and what civilian leaders in the Pentagon have said.
Because climate change is creating deprivation in parts of the world in which become incubators for terrorism.
Yes, I would look at it more broadly than that, though. Something like half to 2/3 of the world's population is in the Eurasian landmass, and they tend to be concentrated on the coastal lines, and therefore they're exposed to some of the possible effects of climate change or other kinds of natural disasters. Whether it's the tsunami in Indonesia, the earthquakes in Nepal and off Japan, and so forth. And inevitably, when those things happen, it's the United States military that is called upon to help provide relief and to help address the drivers of instability in those countries. I mean, you look at a country like Bangladesh, for instance. You've got a country that's the size of Mississippi, with half the population of the United States, and much of it's underwater. If there were a natural disaster there, inevitably the United States military would be called upon to address it. There's a second point, though. Let me address the second point. There's the old maxim that amateurs talk about tactics and professionals talk about logistics. One of the most decisive functions of the modern battlefield, going back over a century, is fuel, whether it's coal or gasoline or oil or what have you. And there's legion stories of troops outrunning their supply lines. Obviously, if we could develop ground vehicles, radios, other kind of communication systems that didn't rely so much on fossil fuels but could get their energy from stored battery power or from the sun, then that would eliminate some of the demands on our logistics system. Right. So the military has both strategic reasons, but also its own logistic reasons to address this.
So I'm confused. So so getting out of the Paris Agreement was good. Why?
Well, so it. So I'm trying to figure out, though, why was it good to stay in it? Because on the one hand, it was voluntary, non-binding commitments, but on the other hand, it was the last chance for salvation on Earth. I mean, those are not consistent either. I would say that the main reason in the long term for the United States to leave that accord is because although non-binding in principle, it was designed to be binding in practice. It was designed, when combined with the very high goal that we set and the very low goal that our peer competitors set, to create a kind of political and public pressure on the United States to make it mandatory, or through threatened lawsuits by Democratic attorney generals or activist groups to make it mandatory in practice. We're still going to be the world's leader in environmental protection. We're still going to see a decline. Well, you laugh. I mean, it's just a fact. I mean, I suggest that you go to China.
It may not be because of the government, though. I mean, isn't that right? There's enormous momentum behind green energy and conservation and some of these things on the part of businesses, on the part of communities.
Sure.
State of California, state of New York.
If there's a problem to be solved by making a buck, some American is going to figure out how to solve that problem. And I saw yesterday some critics saying that, well, we're not going to be the world's leader in solar panels anymore. The Paris Climate Accord had nothing to do with whether or not we're the world leader in solar panels. It's whether or not we can make a better solar panel and sell it at a lower price. And lots of people want to buy those things because it's a lot cheaper to just let the sun shine on a panel in the long run, especially if you can store that electricity, than to try to dig it up and produce it. So, I mean, it's like, look at the cap on this water bottle. 10 years ago, that cap would have been much bigger. And now it's much smaller. And they market that as being environmentally friendly. That's not why the water bottle company did it. They did it because it saves money on their plastic inputs. Yeah. That's the whales. The whales were
I apologize, by the way, we have no glasses here, so I'm doing a lot of Marco Rubio's.
Whales were threatened in the 19th century because of whaling, in no small part because of the need for whale oil for illumination. Ultimately, it wasn't activism that saved the whales. It was John D. Rockefeller figuring out how to refine kerosene on a mass level to produce a more efficient and more affordable form of illumination. That's right. Capitalism and market forces ultimately are the best way to protect the environment.
And we have, the Elon Musks of the world who are doing that, but he also was deeply critical of the and withdrew from the president's economic council as a result of the decision yesterday. Let me, about that intelligence committee that you're on. You've been an outspoken critic of Russia. There's been a little bit of ambiguity on the part of the president about his view of Russia. Why don't you elaborate on your view?
Russia is an adversary, and they've been an adversary for a very long time. Many Americans think the Cold War ended in 1991. In reality, it was just halftime, and Vladimir Putin felt that Russia was behind, and now he's playing catch-up in the second half. And Vladimir Putin is a KGB officer, and he always has been, and always will be. This is why I consistently called in my time in Congress in the second Obama term for a tougher line on Russia, and we consistently didn't get that until after the election. Although I would say, and this that someone wants to dispute that Barack Obama took a tough line on Russia. He's pressed a reset button with them in February of 2009, just 6 months after they invaded Georgia. When you had a bipartisan support from the Armed Services Committee in 2015 to send weapons to Ukraine and the administration refused to do so. When Syria crossed Barack Obama's own red line, the main client in the Middle East, and Barack Obama walked away from bombing them because he didn't want to upend his relationship with Russia and Iran in the Middle East. Let me share with you one small story.
That must be why Putin has such a fondness for him.
Putin has a fondness for leaders he can push around. Let me share with you one small point that is an example of what I'm talking about. So it is well documented. There was a story in Politico yesterday about Russian diplomats from the embassy in Washington who violate the rules governing travel for embassy officials. They don't seek permission at all to get outside the radius they're permitted to travel, or they submit it at 4:55 on a Friday afternoon and then they just leave. And they're later discovered just wandering around out in open fields or on beaches. And lo and behold, they just happen to be standing over critical infrastructure nodes on which this country depends. The Intelligence Committee has repeatedly pushed the State Department, well back into the Obama administration, to cooperate more with the FBI so the FBI could conduct its counterintelligence function and decide whether we're going to let these Russian diplomats travel away from their embassy. I wrote the provision that would have required that. It passed unanimously in our Intelligence Authorization Act. After the election, after the Obama administration fingered Russia for hacking those emails and releasing them, I got a phone call from a senior administration official asking me to withdraw that provision because it would be too provocative towards Russia. That's the kind of conciliation that Russia got for 8 years under Barack Obama.
You've got supporters on that. Because Barack Obama isn't president now and Donald Trump is, what I'm asking you is about this investigation. What did Russia do based on what you've seen in the last election?
So the intelligence community, the CIA, FBI, and NSA in particular, issued a report on January 6th that said that Russia hacked into those emails, the DNC and John Podesta, and they released those emails. I have no reason to doubt that conclusion. It's consistent with what Russia has done in other countries. It's consistent with what Russia has done for decades.
At the direction of Putin.
He was at least aware of it, the intelligence community concluded. It was either Russian intelligence services or affiliated persons and organizations. But again, this is...
He said today it might have just been a great patriot, is what he was quoted as saying today.
Well, as I said, Vladimir Putin is trained as a KGB officer, and the KGB has a long history of deception and disinformation and manipulation. In 1983, during the most tense period of the late Cold War, we were prepared to deploy intermediate-range nuclear forces to Europe to counteract the SS-20 systems that Russia had deployed, or the Soviet Union had deployed to Eastern Europe. There was massive protests in the United States and Western Europe. We now know that those protests and those opposition organizations were deeply infiltrated by Russian intelligence and many times funded by it. That exact kind of thing is going on today in Western Europe and in North America.
What should the response of America be to the hacking of our elections?
They hacked emails. They didn't hack election, to be specific.
Right.
That implies
They impacted on
they
our
hacked
election.
and changed vote
And,
counts, which
and
there's no
apparently
evidence
were
they did.
active in social media to try and influence the outcome as well.
Look, I mean, I've said for a long time that we should take a much tougher line against Russia. They are not our friends. They are an aggressor, not just in friendly countries like Georgia and Ukraine where they occupy territory, but throughout Europe in similar activities. There's a whole host of things that we could do to take a tougher line against them. One thing we should do is stop compartmentalizing our relationship with hostile nations like Russia and Iran. I mean, you hear this a lot from the bureaucracy in Washington that, we can view, the Iran nuclear deal on one hand separate from Syria or Iran's support for Hezbollah on the other hand. I know they can, but that's not the way our adversaries see it. They see every touch point as an opportunity to gain leverage against the United States. We should do the same thing with Russia. We should have started long ago. We should do more now than we are.
Well, the aforementioned President Obama put some withering sanctions on Russia.
I wouldn't say they were withering.
And the Europeans, he brought the Europeans together into that. That has had an impact on you. You concede it has an impact on the Russian economy.
And I wouldn't say they were withering. We could have done more. We should have done more, like sectoral sanctions on their oil and gas or their refining sectors, their banking sector, and so forth. Again, this is of a piece with President Obama being too weak on Russia for 8 years. I'm sorry, I just think he was. I know many people here may disagree. He's the one that made fun of Mitt Romney in the debates in 2012 for having a 1980s mindset. I mean, 1930 should call him about his foreign policy.
But you've got the intimation that you had people representing this president who were feeling out and talking to the Russians about these sanctions. Would that be disturbing to you if that was held out as a...
So I don't know what the topic of conversations were in any of these meetings that's been reported in the media. And there are multiple stories in the media based on anonymous sources that I can promise you are false. I'm not saying the reporters mean to get it wrong. I'm just saying their sources are either misleading them or only have half the picture. I know that for a fact from my work on the Intelligence Committee. So, when stories are anonymously sourced, the more sensational the allegation, the more they're based on double or triple hearsay, I'd say the less you should credit them. Doesn't mean they are false, just the less you should credit them. And the more you should allow Bob Mueller and his team or the Senate Intelligence Committee to do our work and try to get to the bottom of the facts and issue a final report.
Would it be disturbing to you if that were the case, that in the transition, while the sitting president was imposing additional sanctions against the Russians, that General Flynn was talking about relaxation of some of these things?
Well, it's not disturbing that any transition official is meeting with any foreign official. I mean, that's very common. I'm sure it happened to you here in Chicago. Every foreign minister, ambassador was traipsing their way to meet with President-elect Obama's team, just like they did at the DNC in 2008. I mean, at the RNC in 2012 was my first convention ever. I was kind of surprised by the number of foreign officials there. As to the content of the conversation, I just can't assess what was said because I don't know what was said. We're going to have a chance to interview Jared Kushner and Mike Flynn and the rest, and we should let them tell their side of the story, and we'll follow the facts where they lead us.
You're going to be interviewing, apparently, Director Comey next week unless the White House intervenes. First of all, should the White House intervene?
I would say let Jim Comey speak his mind. There's been enough said through innuendo and rumor and triple hearsay that I think it's valuable that he set the record straight.
It would be
now,
also,
again, I'm not
the optics of kind of claiming executive privilege would not be good either, would it?
I think, as the president has said, that if he did nothing wrong, and he thinks his team did nothing wrong, the best thing for him is for all of this to be resolved in a thorough, fair, and prompt fashion. And having protracted litigation over what this or that privilege does cover is not serving that interest.
How do you think they've handled it so far?
They could have been more disciplined and focused on the president's agenda rather than on chasing every story that's in the news. The president got elected because he saw things about the problems of the American people, especially problems in places that Barack Obama won twice, like Iowa and Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin, not based on all of the stories that the media keeps chasing with its hair on fire all the time. He's the president. he needs to focus on the governing agenda. He's got lawyers and other people who can handle this matter, and if what he says is true, then it'll all be behind us soon enough.
That was a very disciplined and focused answer. He should take lessons from you. In terms of Comey, what do you want to ask him?
Well, since I think I'm about 12th out of 15 in seniority on the Senate Intelligence Committee, I don't know, I may just ask him
What
about
he had for lunch that day?
last night's ball games.
Yes.
So I think we should talk a little bit more about the decisions he made through the course of the 2016 campaign, which had many Democrats calling for his resignation until President Trump actually dismissed him. I also think we need to address all these stories that have been in the media. There are stories in the media that says Jim Comey went back and typed up a memo every time he met with Donald Trump. I don't know if that's true or not. I certainly don't know if the contents of those claims are true.
Do you expect to see those memos before he testifies?
I don't know. I don't know. The stories you're reading in the newspaper, though, is what Donald Trump said, according to Jim Comey's memo, according to someone who had it, according to a New York Times reporter who had it read to him. That's a lot of links that can introduce a lot of confusion or misunderstanding or just false reporting.
Well, you'll have a chance to clear that up.
He'll have a chance to clear the record. And I think also he'll need to address some of the things he has said in his past testimony if media reports are to be believed now. You've seen media reports that said that he felt that President Trump was trying to influence the direction of the investigation. He has testified, as has acting director Andy McCabe, that there was no effort to influence or direct the investigation. So he's going to have to reconcile those two claims. But again, I think it is in everyone's interest for this to be done in a fair, thorough, prompt fashion. So we can figure out exactly what happened, if anything, and if not, put it behind us and focus on the agenda that matters.
Do you feel like that your committee, there's been some trouble on the House side. Do you think your committee is functioning in a bipartisan and forthright way?
I do so far. The Senate Intelligence Committee, like the Armed Services Committee, is one of the more bipartisan committees. It's a serious business. The people who seek out that committee usually take it pretty seriously as well. It's a committee, unlike almost any other committee, in which seniority and other things don't go into effect. It's the sole decision of Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, so they tend to put people on there that they think will take it seriously as well. Richard Burr and Mark Warner have worked pretty effectively together so far, and I hope that continues.
This will be a test, won't it, this Comey hearing? That's going to be high drama.
We'll see.
All right, maybe low drama.
It would be better if we just reduce the level of drama in Washington entirely.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the bar's set so that you certainly could do that without much effort. So you're on another, because you don't have enough to do, you're on another interesting panel, and that's the group that Mitch McConnell assembled. Was 13 of you? 13, 14?
It was 13 in the early meetings, but now it's kind of a movable feast open to everyone. So
13.
I think probably two-thirds of all the senators on our side have been in and out of these meetings now.
13 of you guys, lots of dudes, no women. Why was that?
I don't know why Mitch had the early meetings with. Well, I should say. So I was part of an even smaller group. Right as the House was passing its legislation, it was Lamar Alexander and Ted Cruz and Cory Gardner, Rob Portman, Mike Lee, and me. And I think Mitch wanted to fold that working group in that had a few weeks head start, along with essentially his committee chairman, people like Mike Enzi from the Budget Committee, Orrin Hatch from the Finance Committee. But as I said, it's really more of a committee of the whole based on who's interested. Joni Ernst comes regularly, Shelley Moore Capito comes regularly, other senators who aren't reported come regularly as well. Some people have more interest or experience in insurance markets and regulations or Medicaid, or their state cares more about one than the other. So it really is kind of a functional committee of the whole.
You're a really, really smart politician, and I spent my life in politics, so I don't mean that as a pejorative.
Better than being a dumb politician.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's no doubt about it.
You've had a lot of
I've seen both.
You've had a lot of experiences with those as well.
Yeah, most of them are. sit there and they're not.
They're evenly
they're not senators anymore.
They're evenly distributed across the two parties.
But just the optics of that. If you were whispering in the leader's ear, wouldn't you have said, "Hey, maybe we should have some women on this committee"?
Ultimately, what matters is the product we produce, and passing legislation that's going to be better for Americans.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of firm voices in our conference. Mitch made the decisions he did, and what will matter in the end is the product that we produce.
Got some Arkansans here.
Do we? Any Arkansans?
Speaking of.
All right, there's two.
Speaking of Arkansas, Arkansas's actually done pretty well under the Affordable Care Act. You had, I think, 21% uninsured when the law was passed. It's down to 8 or 9% now. I think 9%. 9%. So you have it seems to me, because you said, and I know you believe that the quality of life issues, or the pocketbook issues, quality of life issues are what drive people, not some of the stuff that fascinates Washington. This is a kind of big stakes process for your constituents.
Sure, and we work, the 6 Arkansans who serve in Congress work pretty closely with our governor and our legislative leaders on these matters. And our governor would say that he wants to see Obamacare repealed, and he wants to see Medicaid in particular with more authority, discretion, flexibility for the states, and accountability for those states, unlike Arkansas, that have much higher spending on a per beneficiary basis than to do some of the more frugal states. As you mentioned, the Medicaid expansion in Arkansas is different from most states. Rather than just dump everyone, which are mostly you're talking about able-bodied adults who are above the poverty or above the Medicaid income level, that's the core of the expansion. Rather than dump them into
basically the working poor,
into the
largely.
Traditional Medicaid program, which is like disabled and elderly and severely indigent. It took that pot of money and put that group of people on private insurance, which has given the governor more flexibility. They just actually moved 70,000 people off of Medicaid and moved them into the insurance markets with another waiver, which again gives the governor and the legislature more flexibility to design health insurance plans that work for those people. That's what I would suggest.
The first waiver came under the Obama administration, right? So
it did. It didn't go as far as they would like. It was passed under a Democratic governor. Our Republican governor sought a new waiver in 2015 and didn't get that. He may seek that from this Department of Health and Human Services. I don't know. I haven't consulted with him about that. But it's that kind of flexibility and discretion that I think would be better for our states and ultimately better for Medicaid beneficiaries, because it would be able to design plans that fit them better for the needs of their local communities. Like getting your health insurance or getting your health care coverage in Chicago is very different from getting it in East or South Arkansas because of the population density and the major hospital systems and so forth. I think we need to give more flexibility and authority to our states to tailor the program that helps their citizens, rather than try to impose a one-size-fits-all.
One of the concerns that was raised about the House bill was the impact on rural hospitals. Are you concerned about that?
Sure. I mean, most of Arkansas is rural. But I mean, one thing that's important to know is you're going to have a long transition period. None of these things are going to happen this year if the bill's passed. There's going to be I forget what the exact details of the House bill was. I'm pretty confident that if the Senate can pass a bill, it'll be an even longer transition period with more flexibility and probably a little more money up front to support that transition period, restoring also some of the reductions in reimbursements that hospitals of all kinds, but especially rural hospitals, depended upon before Obamacare reduced those in exchange for what they thought would be increased populations. But it's something that I keep in mind. It's something that most Republican senators keep in mind. Most Republican senators these days come from states with pretty big rural areas.
I've got a child with a chronic illness, a classic pre-existing condition. One of the concerns that was raised about the House bill is that people with pre-existing conditions would be priced out of the insurance market. So it's fine to say you have access to health care, but it's like saying I have access to a Maserati. That doesn't mean that I can afford one. Is that going to get remedied in this, in your
Well, that's my intent, and I think that's the intent of virtually all Republican senators as well. I mean, Obamacare took a particular approach to trying to provide health insurance for people with pre-existing conditions. It has what's called guaranteed issue, which means a health insurer has to provide health insurance to anyone. That's apt to stay. It had a very limited band of what you could charge people for their insurance, and then it required everyone to get it. Some of those things are very unpopular, and they haven't worked all that well. There's other ways to address the pre-existing condition issue. One of those ways is to eliminate the mandate, which I think we should do, give insurers more flexibility to make actuarially sound decisions and offer more plans with more diversity. You know, if you're 23 and able-bodied, you're very different than if you're 42 and you've got young kids. And for those people who find themselves unable to pay those premiums, just give them a little more financial assistance based on their age and based on their income level.
Isn't the sort of rationale of insurance, though, this notion that the insurance companies balance risk? So if you have young or able-bodied people who aren't going into the system, then it makes it an untenable proposition.
Well, that's why you want to encourage them to get into the system and stay in the system. So there's some of the changes the law made under Obamacare that our law will probably preserve. So like, for instance, if you speak to insurance actuaries, they'll tell you that...
And I do all the time, by the way.
I'm sure. It's fascinating conversation. I wish we could just go back to North Korea where the problems are easier. No, they'll say that the provision, for instance, that says you have to keep your children on a plan until they're 26. It adds very little to the cost of insurance. It actually helps balance out some of the risk pools, and it creates the right kind of consumer habits for the industry as a whole because it encourages them to get insurance and stay on insurance.
I think let me interrupt for a second. We're queuing up for questions, and I see. And we've got people with microphones. Let me just say, because of my experience in the healthcare system, I feel very strongly about the progress that has been made under the Affordable Care Act, but I am open to any answer that doesn't take us back.
Well, and I don't dispute it.
And I don't know if you can arrive at one.
Well, no, the healthcare system has been troubled for a very long time, and Obamacare certainly benefited people to some degree. I think it hurt a lot more people. Now, the benefits for that smaller population may be greater on a per-person basis than the costs were. I think, though, that there's other novel ways that we can make sure that people who have severe disabilities, who need coverage continuously, still have that kind of coverage while not hurting so many working Arkansans or working Americans who are seeing their premiums and deductibles continue to increase. You know, I've done town halls all around the state of Arkansas.
I saw one of them on TV. It looked pretty spirited.
And it was. And there's a couple people who stood up and they had a pre-existing condition or they had a severe health problem. They were worried about their health, or maybe it was their parent. They were worried about that. And I totally understand it, and I want to make sure we have a healthcare system that protects them. What you may not have seen on CNN or MSNBC is that there was a woman who stood up and said, I've lost my insurance twice, and I now have to work 3 jobs to pay for my premium and my deductible. So there's conflicting tensions there. And I think that we can do a better job of balancing those tensions than has happened under Obamacare as it's played out over the last 7 years.
Senator, we should take some questions from the audience here. And thankfully, the students are handing out microphones, so I don't have to call on anyone and anger everybody else.
Senator, thank you very much for being here today. I think there are movements growing in both parties that could be characterized as threatening to democracy and democratic foundations. The complicated relationship between college campuses and free speech on the left, the proliferation of fake news on the right. As a partisan political leader who sometimes benefits from the galvanizing movement or effect that these things have for your parties, are you concerned about them? And if so, what are you doing to actively mitigate them?
Well, let me take an even broader perspective than you have, not just here in the United States, but across the West. You've seen populist movements on both the right and the left. You know, here we tend to focus on Donald Trump now because he's the president, but don't forget that Bernie Sanders...
I think he would insist.
Yeah. I mean, the Democratic Party had its own populist insurgency, and Bernie Sanders came that close to winning. And you see the same thing in Europe as well. That's what drove the vote for Great Britain to leave the European Union. But it's not, you've seen right-wing parties in France and Germany and the Netherlands, but it's not just the right wing there either. In Southern Europe in particular, in countries like Greece and Europe and Spain, you see left-wing populism. That's in part, in my opinion, that traditional politicians and traditional parties have neglected some real practical concerns that voters have. And when the traditional parties of the center-right and the center-left neglect those concerns, we shouldn't be surprised that voters turn to unorthodox, non-traditional parties and individuals to address them. I mean, look what just happened in France. The two parties that have governed France for 60 years both got repudiated. Neither one of them made it into the runoff. So I think what's incumbent upon us is that we address those concerns that voters have. When that happens, the voices that are less orthodox, more untraditional, don't have the same kind of purchase. I mean, look in the United Kingdom, what's happened there. The United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, has essentially had its platform eliminated because the people of Great Britain voted to leave the European Union, and the Tory party is moving forward with that popular mandate. So that's when I say we focus on the agenda and what really matters to Americans. I'd focus on those kind of issues. And I think you'd see probably less partisanship, less polarization if more people in America felt like they were getting ahead, not falling farther behind. I mean, look, I'll give you an example. I mean, David can probably recall one of these firsthand. I thought one of the defining moments of our primaries last winter and spring, particularly in Iowa and New Hampshire, small states, lots of candidates still running, so correspondents can run all over the state and do 6 different events in a day. So you'd have smarties in Washington sitting in a green room. David wouldn't be there. He's here in Chicago. But all these guys in the green room,
yes.
You
get a real perspective.
Yeah, real perspective from the heartland. But you'd have Anderson Cooper or Brett Baer or some anchor there with all these pundits from the left and right. And they'd ask some correspondents, like, well, where are you right now? It's like, well, I'm at a Bernie Sanders rally. It's like, is everybody there a committed Bernie supporter? So, actually, there's a lot of people here that said they were trying to decide to vote between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And everybody in the green room laughed, ho-ho, dumb voters. They don't even understand the vast differences. Like, no, the joke is on the people in that green room in Washington. They don't understand that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump were speaking to some of the same anxieties. Radically different solutions, of course, but speaking to some of the same anxieties. And in fact, if you went to a Bernie rally, which I didn't, or you watched one on C-SPAN, which I did, you would see that many of the things that Bernie Sanders said in those rallies could have been said by Donald Trump. He said, they're lying to you about unemployment. More people are unemployed than they're telling you. Who's the they? What's the antecedent of they? It's the Obama administration. He'd also say, raise your hand if your health insurance premiums have gone up. Almost everyone in the room would raise their hand. That could have been said by Donald Trump. In some cases, it may have been. That's what I mean when I say we should focus on what matters most to Americans. I think that may turn down the temperature of our politics a little bit as well if more Americans feel like they're getting ahead and not falling behind.
Stand up.
Someone has a microphone.
Good afternoon, Senator. You issued a strong statement of support for the recent arms deal that Donald Trump signed with King Salman in Riyadh. And Saudi Arabia, as is commonly known, has engaged in what's deemed to be a very war crimes-ridden campaign, bombing the Houthis in Yemen, in addition to support for rebel movements in Saudi Arabia, which have conspicuously allied themselves with the Al-Nusra Front and other terrorist movements, in addition to an abhorrent human rights record domestically. Is this the kind of power the kind of state that we want holding this kind of hegemony in the region and try to bring as many other Middle Eastern states under their sphere of influence with this record?
Well, it would certainly be better for our traditional Arab allies to be more influential in the region than Iran, which is the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism, and which is still actively trying to build towards a nuclear weapon, which is actively undermining American interests throughout the region and really throughout the world. Some of the systems that we're providing to Saudi Arabia will hopefully allow them to be more discriminating. It'll allow them to be more effective in their efforts to stop what is an Iranian-backed proxy on their border. They have every right to be concerned about their mortal enemy, the Islamic Republic of Iran, supporting an insurgency on their border. That's not the only thing that Donald Trump did in Saudi Arabia, though, either. He also helped create a counterterrorist financing source, and he made a point that it's not enough for these countries to focus just on what their government does. They have to focus on what their citizens do as well. Just like we don't let rich Americans run around supporting terrorism or supporting crime here, these countries need to do a better job of cracking down on their private citizens supporting funding for terrorism. He got their commitment. He got their promise that they're going to be held accountable, and that center is going to help them do so in the future. If they don't, then there should be consequences for that. But Countries like Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, like Jordan, have been traditional allies in the Middle East of ours for many years. Do I agree with every practice of those countries? No, I don't. Do I worry about what will happen in the Middle East to American interests if Iran completes its campaign of imperial aggression? Even more so.
That's a difficult choice, isn't it? And a difficult balance to strike, because a lot of people were concerned when the president said to the Saudis, we're not going to tell you how to live, because the coded message was, we're not going to lecture you or take any position on human rights. The United States traditionally has been a beacon to people around the world as a champion for human rights. It's one of the things that's distinguished us. How far should we go in sacrificing that status and that role in service of security that you say is served by these alliances? Because there seems to be a real fascination with autocrats.
Well, we can never walk away from those commitments because they're deeply held moral convictions of the American people. And the American people ultimately demand that kind of policy from their leaders. And if their leaders completely abandon it, they may be able to do that for a few years, but ultimately they will elect new leaders. The American people also demand that they have leaders that keep our country safe and secure. So that's a balance you have to strike. Look, we're not going to create Jeffersonian democracies around the world at the drop of a hat. If we've learned anything in the last 16 years, it should be that. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Egypt, in Syria, what we can do is work with countries who are our friends and who have been our partners to try to make them more secure so they can help make us more secure and help them give them the security and the confidence they need to make progress on their own internal governance practices. Are they going to have the U.S. Constitution right away? No, they're not. Can their citizens live with a greater degree of freedom and prosperity and still have security? Yes, they can. Look at a country like the United Arab Emirates. It's possible.
Yeah, I mean, it was striking that right at the same time that Trump was there, President Trump was there and making the pronouncements he was making, Iran had an election. I make no allowance for Iran's activities in the region and exportation of terror, but they had an election.
Sham election.
That doesn't
sham election.
So the outcome
the outcome is predetermined when the Ayatollahs pick who can be on the ballot from the beginning.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of the point. They had an election, which is different than Saudi Arabia. So anyway, let's take another question.
Hi, my name is Matt Enlow. I just finished my second year at the law school, so thank you for your compliment of us being hard workers. We do work quite hard. I had a class this quarter.
That's not your question, is it?
No. I had a class this quarter with Eric Posner called Trump and the Presidency, and as you might imagine, we were very busy. One of the concerns that was raised by both conservatives and liberals in the class was that the Republican Party seems to be trending more towards party over country in the recent days and weeks. Some of the concerns that were raised were whether, if anything comes to light from the Intelligence Committee's inquiries and from independent investigator Mueller's inquiries, what would it take for you personally, because I know you can't speak for your colleagues, to seriously consider impeachment if there's been impropriety on the part of the president, the vice president, or others?
Well, so first off, I reject the premise of your question that Republicans are increasingly putting party above country. And second, I mean, the question you ask is speculative and hypothetical. Well, I'm not going to speculate about wild-eyed, hair-on-fire hypotheticals that you see in the news every single day. I will say this: Dianne Feinstein, who was the senior Democrat on the Intelligence Committee until January, meaning that she had access to more information than anyone else in the Senate and the House besides 7 others, and is now the senior Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, meaning she has access, along with Chuck Grassley, the senior Republican, to sensitive FBI information, has said twice in the last month that she saw no evidence of wrongdoing or collusion from Donald Trump or his associates in the campaign last year. So before the media and Donald Trump's partisan opponents get ahead of themselves on impeachment, they might want to produce a shred of concrete, tangible evidence. That's what we're looking for on the Intelligence Committee, and we will follow that evidence wherever it takes us, but we will not jump to conclusions in a rush to criticize or indulge some of the worst fantasies of the left.
Would you mind talking a little bit about your immigration bill with Senator Perdue and what your perspective is on the economic impacts of cutting legal immigration by half?
So immigration is one of those issues on which Donald Trump distinguished himself from every other candidate on that stage last year and from Hillary Clinton. Immigration is one of those issues that's roiling the politics of Western Europe, particularly since Angela Merkel just threw open the borders of the EU to migrants. Traditional parties and politicians need to address this issue. If not, it's going to lead to more parties on the fringes in Europe and more non-traditional politicians in America as well. So immigration has a lot of different facets. So security enforcement is one of the biggest. My legislation wouldn't touch on that at all. Donald Trump has almost all the authority he needs under pre-existing law. He should use that authority to secure our borders and enforce the laws. My legislation would focus on legal immigration. Right now, something like only 1 out of 14 or 1 out of 15 green cards that we issue in this country is issued every year based on someone's skills, their job skills and training, their language skills, their educational attainment, the level of income that they would get in this country. We should change that. And that's been an accepted bipartisan principle through many failed efforts to reform our immigration system. So why don't we just focus on the part where we can agree? So the first version of my legislation, which you've seen, would have 3 main parts. It would those 3 parts would touch on non-economic green cards. First, it would limit family reunification to immediate families, spouses, and minor children. Second, it would cap the refugee program at 50,000, which is still above where it's been historically for the last 15 or 20 years. And third, which takes away the president's discretion, whether it's Barack Obama or Donald Trump, to move it up or down according to whatever he wants to do. And third, it would eliminate the diversity lottery, which serves no humanitarian or economic purpose. I'm working on a new iteration of that bill, which will address economic-based green cards, of which there are only about 140,000 given each year. And what would that do? That would change our legal immigration system into the kind of system that Canada and Australia has. So rather than having lots of subjective categories that are malleable, it would have a very simple, straightforward, almost mathematical formula. It would give points based on the level and quality of your education, on your age, on the income level for the job you've been offered in this country, on any distinctive accomplishments you have, like major prizes or athletic accomplishments, on your English language skills, and so forth. I think that would be great for our economy. That's exactly what Canada and Australia have done for years. It would take what is a very unbalanced legal immigration system, which is designed not even around low-skilled or unskilled immigration, but primarily just among random categories of people, extended family members or people who get lucky in the diversity lottery. And it would reorient it towards the kinds of skills and jobs that our economy needs. And it would be better for our economy. It would, I think, produce better, higher-paying jobs for those immigrants. It would not put so much downward pressure on the wages of unskilled and low-skilled American workers, and it would make us much more competitive in the world as well.
We're on a college campus. It was recently reported that the number of foreign students applying to American colleges and universities has declined by about 40% in the last few months. Does that concern you? It seems to me it's a positive thing for the country to be a magnet for bright. You just said yourself.
We should view our legal immigration system as a kind of NFL draft, and we should be focused on the very best prospects we can get from around the world. We don't want those people to be in Germany or in China or in India or anywhere else. We want them to be here in the United States.
But they're apparently discouraged now from coming here. Isn't that a negative thing?
Well, they ought not be discouraged. There's no reason for them to be discouraged. There hasn't been a change. There hasn't been a change in any policy. My legislation should be encouraging to them, because my legislation would give them a much better shot at getting a green card and staying here. Like the person in my proposal that I'll be introducing in revised form in the coming weeks, who is most apt to get a green card, is a single person in his or her mid to late 20s who has an advanced degree in science, technology, engineering, or mathematics from an American university.
And can play in the NFL.
If they can do that, that's great. Or if they've won a Nobel Prize or anything else like that. That's the kind of person we should be encouraging.
We have time for one more question, and somebody has a microphone.
Hi, I have a question that hasn't been in the headlines, but is something that's really concerned me. We've effectively moved towards reducing regulations by not staffing our regulatory bodies, and I'm wondering what actions you see being taken in DC to make sure we have enough commissioners at FERC, the SEC, the FTC, and sufficient staff to go through the backlog of issues in front of them.
I've urged the president and his senior team to move faster on nominating people to all the departments and the agencies. Whatever you think about any president's agenda, that's the democratic accountability in our system, is that we have an elected president, and then he has secretaries and deputies and under and assistant secretaries whom he has appointed and the Senate has confirmed to defend his agenda or to manage that department. It is not a healthy thing to have career civil servants, as noble and hardworking and talented as they may be, running these departments, because we have elections so the American people can have a say in the way their government is run. And the way to do that is to get these nominees to us at a faster pace so we can review them. This is not a Senate issue. I don't think there's a single person pending on the Senate calendar right now who has gone through a committee hearing and is waiting for a vote. There may be two.
Commissioners have been nominated, but I think their hearing is pending.
Yeah, and I think we have one vote on a general counsel when we get back next week. But we've repeatedly been clearing the decks in the Senate each week of these nominees. So it's not a backlog in the Senate, it is a backlog in the administration getting these nominees to us. And I and almost every senator on the Republican side, at least, I can assure you, has said to the president and to Reince Priebus and to the cabinet secretaries, you need to get these people to us. It's good for you.
What is the problem?
Well, I think part of the issue is that Donald Trump is new to politics, so he doesn't have a long, vast retinue of people who have been with him for decades. I mean, when you're a Bush or a Clinton, you have a lot of people who have been with you or been with your dad for a long time and you can draw upon. When you're Barack Obama, you still have a lot of people that you grew up with in Chicago and Illinois politics and so forth. A second one is that Donald Trump is an unconventional politician. There are not a lot of off-the-shelf Trump Republicans, especially in some of the areas where he broke with Republican orthodoxy. There are not a lot of off-the-shelf Republicans who take the Donald Trump approach.
Senator, I want to thank you profoundly because the Institute of Politics, which we're now headed into our 5th year come January, and it's been successful because people like you are willing to spend your time here answering questions and elaborating on your perspectives. And tremendously grateful for that, for your service to this country in uniform and out. And I'm sure you're going to be a central player for a long time to come.
Well, I want to thank you, David. And I want to credit the University of Chicago and the Institute of Politics. You know, too often today on our campuses, you can't have this kind of debate. Obviously, majority opinion in this room doesn't seem to be on my side. But we're
not going to vote, I want you to know.
But can we at least have the Electoral College?
I remember when you guys weren't that enthused about it.
But you and I, although we come from different sides of the aisle, can have a civil conversation in front of a civil audience and air some significant issues for our country without having people mauled or beaten or harassed out of the campus arena the way it's happened too often in campuses. So I want to credit the University of Chicago and the Institute of Politics for the conduct that they demand from all their students and from you in particular for upholding that ideal and being a forceful advocate for freedom of speech and freedom of ideas on college campuses.
Thank you. Well, and as the son of an immigrant, I'm grateful to live in a country where that's possible.
Please join me in thanking Senator Tom Cotton and David Axelrod.